Hello, and welcome to a special late night Glastonbury romance. Let's begin. Next chapter, The Unpardonable Sin. Mr. Owen Evans, seated by the gas stove at the back of old Jones's shop, was enjoying a late breakfast. It was the day following the one wherein Philip Crow conducted Persephone to his subterranean kingdom. Mr. Evans's breakfast differed a great deal from the breakfast partaken by Mayor Wallop on the preceding morning. It lacked the mayor's invisible attendants. It lacked the mayor's Dundee marmalade. It lacked the mayor's Western Gazette. In place of this latter purveyor of topical items, Mr. Evans' bodily refreshments, consisting of a pot of tea and 3 stale rolls, was heightened by the presence of an old edition of the Inferno in the original Italian, open at the page that describes the blasphemous obstinacy of the heathen giant Campanius. As I was then, howled this unconscionable rebel against the Emperor of the Universe, such am I still. Mr. Evans found no difficulty in translating this passage, even though the lettering of the old book was such a stumbling block to modern eyes. And in his troubled response to its terrible import, he placed no less than half of all the butter he possessed upon the piece of roll crust, which he now proceeded to munch in absent-minded voracity. He was disturbed by a heavy knock upon number 2's shop door. He cursed audibly and glanced angrily at one particular clock, among all the other old ticking timepieces, which he had grown accustomed to consulting. He consulted this one not because it kept better time, but because he pitied its woebegone face. He cherished the fancy, in his confused South Wales mind, that he might restore this prestige of the silly old clock among its grander companions if he made this little diurnal preference. But the clock only confirmed the knock. The knock and the clock said the same thing. Reading done, business begun, said the knock and the clock and the clock and the knock. Mr. Evans angrily opened the shop door. This proceeding took more time than one would have supposed the stock in trade of number 2 justified. Never were there so many rusty bolts. But the Welshman got them all down at last, and red in the face and panting hard he opened the barricaded door. Into the shop stepped Sam Decker. Sam's face, to anyone who saw it less frequently than his father in penny pitches, would have displayed a startling change. It had changed from the face of a lad to the face of a man. Sam had come to know something of the terms upon which the happiness of being alive had been offered us. "How do you do, Mr. Evans?" he said. "Oh, are you having your coffee? I'm awfully sorry I'm disturbing you." He made no motion, however, to go away, but proceeded to remove his coat and hat, and lay them both, together with his stick, upon one of number 2's best specimens of the art of 18th century chair-making. Then he sat down, and Mr. Evans, bringing up his own chair from the rear of the shop, sat down too. "I've come to ask you a rather funny question, sir," the visitor began. "But if you know how few people in Glastonbury have books, or care anything for books, you would understand my coming to you. By the way, do you people, does old Jones, sell books as well as antiques? Has he got any old books here? Any old theological books?" The Welshman's face assumed a very odd expression. "Yes," he said with a sort of resigned hesitation. "Oh, yes, there are quite a lot here. I've been going through them. They're down in the basement. It was chiefly because of them that I consented to undertake this shop. Oh, yes, there are quite a lot of interesting books down there, Mr. Decker. But I don't know." There was a moment's silence, during which the shrill cockney voice of Mrs. Robinson, addressing herself to Grandmother Cole, as the ladies moved slowly downtown on their way to St. John's Church, entered through the closed door. "If 'twere only a rat that gnawed him, 'twill be a heavy bit of maiming. But it wanted seed to die be going to be worse to-morrow. Then 'tis more nor rats. Then 'tis moth. And if 'tis moth, 'twill be L's own job. If 'tis moth, I'd sign no, Mr. Vicar. Not on your little life will I undertake such a earth-breaking job." Sam couldn't refrain a faint grin as this overheard revelation of a labor revolt in the ecclesiastical sphere. But Mr. Evans lacked all sense of humor in such matters. The man, hooked nose, sardonic eyebrows, and long upper lip looked as impenetrable to High Street back-chat as the bust of Dante itself, which he was now regarding with a secretive eye. The chairwomen and the sewing woman of St. John's Church passed on down the road, and Sam became as grave as the Welshman. "It may as well be quite open with you, sir," Sam said. "For more than a year now, my father has been hoping that I'd accept his offer to send me to theological college. I've refused to go, and I never shall go. But I want to, read a little more. When I was at Corpus," Mr. Evans interrupted him. "Corpus!" he cried, leaping to his feet. "Do you mean Corpus, Cambridge? I was at Oxford myself, but you Corpus people at Cambridge have got a library. I say you've got a library that would madden Parsinus himself. Paracelsus. There are folios and quartos there that are..." He lowered his voice and, lifting the second finger to his left hand, tapped with the bony knuckle of the first finger of his right hand. "There are Welsh manuscripts there, my good sir, that are priceless. They are prejudiced against me there, but that's nothing. I'm nothing. But if they let me have those manuscripts and take them to South Wales with me and compare them with... why, my good man, they are prejudiced against me there, but that's nothing. What am I? Nothing. Nothing at all. But they've got a number of bardic triads there in an underground chamber. A Welsh bedmaker told me all about it. That give incredible details of Merlin's life. Think of you being at Corpus. They're prejudiced against me there. A trifle. A little. They mean well. But of course. But that's nothing. For what am I? Obviously nothing." Sam Decker watched Mr. Evans' back as he moved about in the stuffy little shop looking for something. Cold, watery sun filtered into the shop through a street window. This window was full of an extraordinary assortment of ill-chosen objects. One could hardly have called them objects of art. They were more like a Noah's Ark of a raft of candidates for limbo. There was a cracked Chinese vase decorated by a series of she-dragons, each of whom was apparently giving birth to, or being suckled by, a double-tailed goldfish. Next to this vase there was a pepper box of unnatural proportions, on the top of which, where it was perforated for shaking, gasped the head of a preposterous Puccinello. Puccinello? Is that Pinocchio? I don't know. A rusty faucet, or ornamental brass, serviceable now for no conceivable purpose, was propped up against the pepper box. At the base of the vase reposed a white-feathered shuttlecock with a vermilion center, while between the pepper box and the window frame was a small croquet mallet of a kind that had become quite extinct. Pacific Ocean shell, on the back of which some meticulous Miss Drew of 100 years ago had painted a sad little landscape, wherein a diminutive goat-herd and a gigantic goat contemplated a sinking ship from a green island. Okay. Leaning against the rim of this painted shell was a big, old-fashioned shaving cup, upon the side of which was sketched a distant view of a castle on the Rhine, seen between two nameless trees and above the back of an overloaded mule. The watery sun, which struggled into old Jones's shop through what portion of the window was not obscured by those objects, enabled Sam to watch every movement of Mr. Evans. The man was standing on tiptoe against a shelf and struggling to open a little china pot, which stood there without removing a marble paperweight which rested on its lid. Sam got hesitatingly up from his seat, but remained with his hand on his arm. There was something distressing, teasing to the nerves, something that set out teeth on edge about Mr. Evans's effort to get his fingers into that little oblong pot. "Ah!" he ejaculated at last. "I feel it now. Ah!" Sam had never seen the human form stretched to such tension as was the form of Mr. Evans with his fingers in that small receptacle. He couldn't help looking at the man's bare heels, both of which were protruding now, at his feet as his feet rose out of his slippers, through large round holes in his knitted socks. His feet came back into their shoes as he uttered this exclamation, and he himself turned with a tiny key in his hand. "Come," he said. "Come, come, come." He led the way to the back of the shop, where at the opposite side to the narrow staircase going up was a still narrower staircase going down. At the top of this he paused, and taking a candlestick from a little bracket began fumbling awkwardly with the matchbox. His helpless struggle with all his inanimate objects had now got on Sam's nerves to such a pitch that he rushed forward to assist him. Between them, the tiny key fell upon the floor. Sam picked it up and handed it to him. A faint stream of sunlight from the window, full of little wavering motes, fell upon Mr. Evans's countenance as, with the key clutched in the palm of his hand, he at last managed to light the candle. Sam was shocked by the nervous trouble upon the man's face. Was it due only to the obduracy of all these little teasing inanimates, vexing like demons the movements of a philosopher? Or was his request for these books the most ill-advised demand with which he could have come upon him? Once more he had an opportunity of studying Mr. Evans's back as he followed him down the dark little staircase. The lifted candle the man carried caused that hooked nose of his, as he turned to warn Sam of a particular step, to become like the nose of an extraordinary old miser visiting his hoard of ducats and guilders. The one eye, too, which was all Sam could see in the shadowy profile, as he went down after him, was like the eye of a demented goshawk. They reached the cellar at last. It was small enough. It was tighter than the shop above. It was a little low room lined with tall bookshelves. Sam saw at once that most of the books were of no interest to him. There were almost all of them ancient magazines bound in leather covers and interspersed with tattered school editions of the classics. One shelf, however, had glass over it, and it was to a keyhole in this glass door that Mr. Evans applied his little key. What was the matter now with that man? His legs were shaking, his knees were knocking together. His fingers must have been shaking too, for the candle grease began dripping over the front of the glass case as he tried to open it with his key. Sam stepped forward and made it as if he would take the candle from him. His gesture was a very natural one under the circumstances. Why, then, did the Welshman turn upon him a look of contorted fury? But the latter got the glass door open finally, and Sam, peering over his shoulder, surveyed the exposed books. They were indeed theological works. Sam had never seen so many parchment-covered and vellum-covered and leather-covered folios. He read the names. They were Bonaventura, and Duns Scotus, and Thomas Aquinas, and Albertus Magnus, and Avicenna, and Bernard, and Jerome, and Anselm. Sam could not restrain a weary, disappointed groan. What good were these to him? He was no scholar. What he wanted was something, well, he really didn't know exactly what he had wanted. For in the world of theological books, Sam had the simple imagination of a student of minnows and butterflies. But he saw Mr. Evans's hand, now hurriedly withdrawn from the shelf, with the beautiful bound book clutched in his fingers. There was a big gap where he had just removed this work and another book that had been standing erect by the one he had taken, toppled sideways now across the gap, and lay there diagonally, resting against some thick medieval tome with an obscure Latin title. Towards this book, Sam's attention was at once attracted, for it was different in appearance from the rest. His sharp, observant bear's eye caught its title in a second. It was called The Unpardonable Sin. And that's the title of this chapter, which we're going to pause in for the night. But until next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Cheers.